Thank you, Tanya. Good afternoon, Asia, and good morning, Europe. Today's webinar's topic is all about the new release for Sangfor HCI and SCP. So this new version, we call it 6.7.0. As Tanya has mentioned, Sangfor HCI is a purely software-defined solution. That is why we are able to keep it evolving to meet customers' different requirements with greater simplicity, great reliability, and high performance. Every time it evolves, it gets new capabilities, and you do not need to have a forklift upgrade for this solution because it's software defined. That is the key essence of Sangfor HCI. And this quarter, we are going to have this 6.7.0 new version, and the new version has gained a great deal of new capabilities to meet our customers' requirements. So let's take a look. First, I'd like to show you a bird's eye view of the new features that are coming on HCI 6.7.0. As you know, SCP is our cloud management for our HCI solution. It turns HCI into a cloud, be it private cloud or managed cloud. So the features we're going to introduce will be divided on on HCI and SCP. So on HCI, this platform is hyperconverged infrastructure. It's more focused on the virtualization capabilities. As you can see here, on 6.7.0, we have added QoS for VM in terms of the CPUs and disk IOs. You are able to set thresholds of the CPU clock speed on a specific VM. You can limit it to a certain threshold so that this VM doesn't consume too much CPU resource. The same, you can also configure the disk IO limitation to the virtual disk of that VM. So your high priority VMs will get enough IOPS as well as enough CPU power. We also have added host CPU overcommitment ratio to the host. It's like the memory overcommitment ratio configuration we have added in the previous versions. Okay, so this CPU overcommitment ratio can help you set a limit to the overcommitment of the CPU resource on a certain host so that you do not overspend that CPU power on the host. And we also have added Linux VM backup. This is highly demanded by our customers. Previously, HCI only supports file level recovery for Windows VM. Now on this version, Linux VM also supports file level recovery from backups. International Keyboard adds support for Italian, Spanish, German, and French, so it gets more international. Backup copies also a highly demanded feature for customers who needs 3-2-1 backup practice on HCI. They want to copy the backup to a secondary storage or an offsite storage so that they can meet compliance requirement in terms of the solution. On SCP, we have also added a couple of new features to make it more cloud complete. Communication domain. This is a feature that you can add multiple HCI clusters, into a resource pool. And even though they may be run on different locations, through communication domain, you are able to create a unified management plan for those different clusters. On these clusters, on this communication domain management plan, you are able to unified management for all the components that are run on the clusters across different locations. It's just like you run a centralized cluster. You can add VF from cluster A, to VM to protect VMs on cluster B. So this communication domain is a big step forward to a larger scale cloud deployment. Network node. So there is a dedicated network node on the HCI, on the SCP to support larger scale cluster deployment. Because when you have a larger scale cluster for the cloud deployment, you may have larger traffic. You may deploy more network devices. So you can designate a specific dedicated network node to handle that network workload. Cluster mode deployment of SCP. Previously, you can only deploy two SCP instances, one active, one standby, to create a cloud environment based on HCI. If SCP A goes down, the standby SCP, takes over the workload. However, for some large-scale deployment, two SCPs, with only one active, may not be able to cope with the management workload. That is why, on this version, SCP will support cluster mode. You're able to deploy 3 SCP instances with VAD to achieve the load balancing and high availability for SCP management plan. Large-scale management can be supported on this version as well. This 6.7.0 supports up to 128 HCI clusters management, and host number goes up to 1024. VPC. Now a single tenant can support multiple VPCs, and one VPC supports multiple gateways. So this delivers a more flexible network configuration on SCP for customers who need to run HCI and SCP for their cloud requirement. So let's go through these new features one by one to take a look, what they are and how they create value for your environment, for your solution. Host CPU overcommitment ratio. This is quite easy to understand, just like memory overcommitment ratio. In a virtualized environment, you are able to overcommit your computing power, including CPU and memory, because when you assign this computing resource to a VM, that VM may in most cases, that VM will not consume all of the assigned resource, in terms of CPU and memory, so that you can, those VMs, they co-share this CPU and memory resource. However, if you have too many VMs sharing the CPU and memory resource from a single node, that node could be overburdened. It could even crumble, with too much workloads, too many VMs running on top. That is why you can set a threshold, on HCI to limit the overcommitment ratio of that particular host, so that you can be assured that on your HCI cluster, there's no node will be overrun by the workload. So the configurable CPU resource equals physical CPU threads multiplied by overcommitment ratio. The overcommitment ratio can be configured by you on HCI's management UI. But remember, this configurable CPU resource also includes the CPU consumption of the system OS, which is our HCI, as well as the SCP. And we don't think other competitors have this feature. Okay, this feature is really fine-grained management and quality of service guarantee for your HCI node's CPU consumption. So the UI looks like this. You can go to System, click CPU overcommitment ratio setting, and then you can configure the ratio by yourself. Usually, we do not recommend you go over 200% because that is an alerting level for CPU overcommitment. But of course, if you need to, you have a very mission critical application, very important VM that you want to it have, high performance and enough resource to run. You can also, set a threshold with 100% ratio here so that you can be rest in peace. This node will never run over its physical CPU capacity. The next great feature that's coming on 6.7.0 of HCI is VM QoS control, and this is a big one because with VM QoS control, you are able to support HCI is able to support limiting CPU frequency and disk I/O on the VM configuration page. And if you have some VMs that have not, that will have been running on the previous version of HCI, when the HCI has been upgraded to 6.7.0, and you keep those VMs running for a while, we will give you a recommendation for the QoS configuration based on the consumption of the workload. And of course, only administrator can configure QoS. The other roles will not be able to configure that because this is highly relevant to the performance of the workloads. And the VM's utilization of the host CPU can be viewed right on the page. But there's a couple of cautions for this feature. Both SCP and HCI have to be version 6.7.0 to support it. That means if you upgrade HCI to 6.7.0 and your SCP stays on 6.3.0, on the SCP UI, you will not be able to configure this QoS. Okay, you have to upgrade both of them to 6.7.0. The second caution is VMware VMs managed by SCP do not support QoS, only Sangfor HCI VMs. And keep in mind that if the QoS is set too low, that VM's performance may be impacted. So you have to take that into consideration. Do not limit, do not set the QoS too low. Let's say, the CPU clock speed, you can figure if you set the threshold of a certain VM to 1 gigahertz, then that VM may not be able to boot up and run. So discretion is required for you to configure the QoS. So the configuration UI is like this. You go to the VM configuration page, you go to the CPU setting, and you can limit the CPU clock speed. Let's say I can limit, the low priority VM that does not consume too much, CPU frequency to 2 gigahertz. And for some important VMs, I can, set the limitation higher, like 2.5 gigahertz, so that this high priority VM, those high priority VMs have more CPU capacity to consume. And the disk I/O is also on the configuration page. You can limit the max read speed, write speed, as well as in terms of IOPS, in the matrix of IOPS and the bandwidth, the throughput of that VM. So you can do it that way to limit the disk I/O of certain VMs to prioritize other VMs, other higher priority VMs. So this is what you can do now with 6.7.0. Next feature, Linux VM backup recovery, file level backup recovery. So this is finally supported on this version. And it's like the Windows VM backups. You are able to view the files and recover a single file or a couple of files or folders from the backup files. Okay, and the cautions are it can only support up to 3 concurrent recovery sessions. That means you are not able to recover files from VMs simultaneous from more than 3 VMs at the same time. And there could be some file systems that are not supported or OSs that are not supported for file level recovery. And files with special characters may not be able to be downloaded. So do not, name your files with special characters. This is also not a, best practice. Files that are larger than 5 GB cannot be downloaded. That's easy to understand, right? Because when you have too large files, it's slow to download. Next feature, not a very groundbreaking one, but this concerns customers' user experience in some countries. Previously, HCI keyboard only supports, only supports English and Chinese. Now, it natively supports Italian, Spanish, German, and French. And you are able to configure and change the keyboard layout on the VM configuration page. And there are, two cautions. Both SCP and HCI needs to be version 6.7.0 and the upper level and upper versions. VMware VMs does not support this upgrade, this new feature. So you are able to configure the keyboard right on the create new VM page, or you can, modify the keyboard on this page. Next feature, backup copy policy. This is a very important feature for HCI to realize the backup best practice, to have 3 backup copies on 2 different medias and at least 1 off-site. So now with backup copy policy that can be configured on HCI, you are able to do 1 backup, on a let's say on the ASAN or external storage, and then copy the backup to a secondary storage or a storage or a HCI cluster on a secondary site to make sure that your backup is secured at a different location or at a different storage medium. Communication domain. This is supported by VXLAN. So let's say if you have 2 or 3 HCI clusters and they are spread between different locations. If you need to manage them, of course, you can have SCP to centralize the management. However, on the what you enjoy is what you get page, you have to separate that, drag and drop operations on different clusters. You have a different window. Now with communication domain supported on this version, those clusters, they can be connected through by VXLAN. And with SCP to centralize the management, you are able to configure and manage all of the virtual components running on those different clusters like in a single cluster. So this massively simplifies the management for multi-cluster deployment across different locations. Also, some cautions need to be taken for this new feature. VMware clusters are not supported. Unlicensed HCI clusters are not supported. You need to make sure that all of your clusters that needs to be put into the communication domain are licensed. And also versions need to be 6.7.0. So far, up to 128 clusters are supported by communication domain. And clusters that you need to put to the communication domain need to have at least 3 nodes to support this new feature. So it can be configured on the SCP UI. SCP Cluster Mode, like I mentioned, if you have a large cluster, let's say more than 10 clusters, then a single SCP may not be able to cope with the concurrency and throughput. So you need to deploy a cluster mode for SCP. Previously, this could not be done, but now with 6.7.0 being released, you are able to configure a cluster mode for SCP. You will have 3 nodes, 3 SCP instances. One serves as the leader, which is taking, taking the leading role of this cluster. The other is backup. The other 2 are backup and follower. So basically, they sync the information between them, and you have a VAD to do the load balancing in front of these SCPs. So basically, it's like you have a traffic that needs to go to the SCP and processed by them. The traffic will be routed to all of the backend SCP instances to share the workload so that the SCP does not become a bottleneck for the performance of your cloud. And there is a bunch of network new features for SCP. Previously, on SCP, the network part is quite fixed. Okay, you can deploy tenants, but one tenant can only have one VPC. Now inside a tenant, you can have multiple VPCs. And in terms of gateways, you're able to deploy multiple network gateways for a single VPC. And those gateways can be bundled with elastic IP pools so that your workloads are able to be trafficked, to be routed to the external world. And also multiple gateways are supported by a public service network. So the network configuration and deployment on the new version of SCP becomes more flexible. And on this HCI 6.7.0, ASAN deployment now supports standard link aggregation. You are able, this feature made HCI more compatible with third-party storage. We know that third-party storage, usually for their deployment, they support link aggregation, standard one, with standard link aggregation. However, previously on HCI, the ASAN configuration link aggregation is customized by Sangfor. That's why when you configure link aggregation for ASAN on the previous version, there's no need to do link aggregation configuration on the switch because the link aggregation is done by the software from HCI side. But now, ASAN network supports standard link aggregation, so you are able to configure HCI to be more integrated with standard link aggregation protocols. You have to configure the link aggregation on the switch side as well to support, more a more wide range of external storage. And there are also, more invisible enhancements on this version. Like we have upgraded our kernel, from a old version to now, version 4. And the QEMU has also been upgraded, to version 5. If you upgrade this platform from 6.3, the live upgrade optimization has been made more aggressive, less than 3 seconds disruption. And we have a more optimized login system through syslog on the back end. The HA and HA startup has also been optimized. The memory ECC also optimized. So many optimizations and enhancements to make this platform more stable and more reliable. You may be wondering when we can have this version. Good news is HCI and SCP 6.7.0 has already been GA, and we are able to deliver this software to you within this week. The actual release date is on Friday. So, starting next week, you are able to upgrade your HCI to the newest version and the most powerful one so far, 6.7.0. And that's the end of today's presentation.